This is part 5 to my APUS history videos on Unit 4, the period of 1800 to 1848. Now we have Jacksonian America. So in the election of 1824, there were 4 candidates running, and because none of them reached the majority, the way that it works is that the decision would move on to the House of Representatives out of the 3, and so that meant that Henry Clay was kicked out because he was the 4th and lowest, but he just so happened to be the Speaker of the House, so he basically made the decision.
The election of 1824 ended with John Quincy Adams as president and Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. This is where the idea of the corrupt bargain began because people thought that Clay was bribed by Adams so that Adams could get the position of president.
So in 1828, we have the Tariff of Abominations. This was an increase in tariffs that was hated by the South, but it was favored by the Northwestern manufacturers. It was supposed to be a protective tariff that would create an even playing field for domestic industries. Now we have the election of 1824. This was Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. This was where you can see the second political era start because there were 2 parties that formed. You have the Democratic Party, which was run by Jackson. Then you have the National Republicans, or the anti-Jacksonians, eventually would be called the Whigs. The Whig Party was created in 1834 out of the National Republicans and the Anti-Mason Party. This was led by Henry Clay. However, Jackson did win in this election. During the age of Jackson, you have the rise of populism. Don't get this confused with the Populism Party. This is just populism with a lowercase p. Basically, it's just saying that you will vote for the person that you relate to the most. Something that Jackson did was that he lowered the property requirements and tax requirements for voting. This would expand Western prominence in the election. Along with these new voting requirements, we have the Dorr Rebellion, which occurred in 1841 and 1842. Rhode Island still had these property and tax requirements for voting in the election, and so Thomas Dorr led a rebellion that said that you should increase our suffrage. So Jackson's presidency is also sometimes called the Common Man Presidency. He was the first president from the West. He wanted equality for all white men. He was against the wealthy establishments, such as the Bank of the U.S., which will lead to the Bank War, but we'll get to that later. So Jackson's cabinet was called the Kitchen Cabinet because it was full of his unofficial and official people that would basically help him make any kind of decisions. Now we have John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president under Jackson in his first term. He wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest in 1828. He urged that states nullify the Tariff of Abomination because he said that these states created the federal government, so they should have the power to nullify some of the states' laws. Something that is related to John C. Calhoun is the Petticoat Affair, and this was basically just caused by Calhoun's wife. It was just a lot of rumors that started going around, and it eventually would lead to Calhoun not being allowed to be Jackson's vice president anymore. Also, something that made Jackson dislike Calhoun as well was the fact that when Jackson helped the U.S. annex Florida, Calhoun was one of the people who thought that Jackson should be punished for overstepping his instruction. So because there were a lot of problems with these tariffs, we have the Compromise Tariff of 1833, once again, by Henry Clay, and this said that tariff rates would be decreased by 10% per year for the next 8 years. The Force Bill was also passed, which said that the president could use the military in the future to collect tariffs, and this was passed on the same day as that compromise. Another thing that Jackson did was remove the Native Americans. So we have the 5 civilized tribe, which was located in the South in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. This included the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes, and they were very civilized tribes. They had a lot of American culture, they spoke English, and they had a written language and wore a lot of Western clothing, but they were still discriminated. So we have the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and this said that those tribes had to be moved west of the Mississippi River. This caused the Trail of Tears from 1830 to 1840, and this was when 100,000 of those Native Americans had to move. Thousands ended up dying, and this can be mostly seen in the winter of 1838. It was a brutal winter, and a lot of them died. So now we are moving on to the bank war. Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the U.S. In 1832, there was a recharter for the Bank of the U.S., but Jackson vetoed it. Jackson also began to stop depositing federal revenue into the Bank of the U.S. and then would eventually move all of the federal money into pet banks, which were state banks. Because of this, Biddle, the president of the Bank of the U.S., called in all of the loans and tightened his credit. Because of this, supporters of the bank blamed Jackson, and supporters of Jackson blamed the bank. This led to an economic crisis, and Biddle relented. Going back to the description of the Whig Party, the Whigs formed in response to King Andrew I. That is what they called Andrew Jackson. They favored a strong central government, promoted internal improvements, and their main supporters were the elite merchants and manufacturers in New England, wealthy merchants in South, and Westerners who supported internal improvements. In Jackson's final years, we have a boom in the economy from 1835 to 1837. There was a surplus in the government, so we have the Distribution Act, which gave this surplus to the states. And we also have the Specie Circular in 1836, and this said that all land payments had to be made with gold and silver. This was mainly just to prevent speculation and problems with inflation. But this did not actually help. It led to the Panic of 1837. Jackson was trying to prevent speculation, but it ended up with a panic. The Panic of 1837 was caused by overspeculation, crop failure, and some bank problems within Europe that would lead to a recall of loans in America. And the effect was that a lot of banks in the US failed. We have a lot of unemployment and a decrease in the price of land. Some more effects was an independent treasury, which said that the government would no longer pay into private banks. And we have Martin von Buren, who was elected in 1836. And all of these problems were blamed on von Buren, but they were actually just Jackson's fault. And eventually he would lose the election in 1840. In this election of 1840, we have Martin von Buren versus William Henry Harris, who was the cause of the win at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So the Whig Party won that populist vote, but William Henry Harrison died 30 days into his presidency, and so John Tyler would become president. Tyler was a Democrat at heart, though, but he still did hate Jackson, so the Whigs refused to support him. So all of the Whig cabinet that was in when William Henry Harrison was president resigned, and Tyler replaced that cabinet with Democratic people, such as John C. Calhoun. This would lead to the development of extreme pro-slavery in the Democratic Party.